it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. Mankind has explored so little of the ocean that it remains, perhaps, our biggest mystery. What lies beneath the waves is unknown to us, and, as such, what lurks beneath the waves gives rise to some of our greatest fears. Join me, my dear friends, around the campfire, as I have an intriguing and mysterious nautical tale for you this evening. The tropical waters were warm, even on a night dive, but Aaron still wore a wetsuit. He switched on the video camera attached to his mask, then pressed the button on his waterproof wristwatch. 70 minutes popped up in black against a staunch grey background, and quickly turned to 69:59, then 69:58, 69:57. The countdown had begun. He pinched his nostrils and splashed into the water. The glow from the waning moon disappeared within seconds, too weak to penetrate the deep waters of the sea. Aaron's excitement was heightened by the rich darkness. Ghosts were always more active at night. When his depth gauge read 15 feet, Aaron stopped descending with a flick of his flippers to hover in the deep blue. This 3-minute safety stop was imperative. If he didn't adjust his body to the pressure change, his lungs could rupture and bleed out. Time stood still below the water's surface, where darkness expanded endlessly in every direction. Bubbles rose from Aaron's mask as he exhaled, purging his blood of nitrogen. He shone a flashlight into the void beneath his feet. What he was looking for lay cloaked in darkness, 70 feet below on the seabed, and it was time to start his descent. Aaron relieved the pressure on his eardrums continuously as he swam through the dark, bluish haze. It took only seconds to reach a depth of 40 feet. If he was on target, the deck of the SS Yongala should be visible beneath him, but there was only blue in every direction. He swam in small zigzags, waiting for the ghost ship to emerge from the darkness. Something bumped Aaron's leg. He dropped the flashlight and turned toward the cold caress to see a dark shadow looming beside him. Wide-eyed and frightened, he tried to scream, jetting the regulator from his mouth while violently kicking to escape the creature. As the shadow moved away, Aaron looked into the darkness after it. Behind him, in front, above, below. It could be anywhere. He became aware of a burning in his lungs, and the panic increased. Reaching up and over with his right arm, he searched for the regulator, finally bumping his hand against a long hose that he pulled to his lips. Salt water invaded his mouth while he pressed the purge valve before taking a life-giving breath. Shivering with fear, Aaron retrieved the flashlight from its long cord and pointed it into the gloom. An enormous grouper hovered a few feet away, investigating the invader to its territory. Aaron's muscles relaxed. Not only was this hulking fish harmless, it was also a sign he was close to the artificial reef created by the wreckage of the Yongala. He followed the slow-moving fish, fanning his flashlight back and forth beneath him. 57 minutes, 18 seconds. A chill ran up Aaron's spine when an enormous shape materialized in the void. The hollow remains of the majestic passenger ship loomed in front of him, concealed in corals and shadow. The gravesite of 122 souls, lost at sea over 100 years ago. Aaron checked the full spectrum camera, EVP recorder, and EMF meter on his belt. The familiar feeling of adrenaline coursed through his veins, driving him on. This was what he came for. Aaron swam over the coral-encrusted skeleton of rusted window frames, where tiny silver fish darted in and out of the darkness. He used landmarks along the ship in search of his destination. The aft mast, the engine room, and the galley were all visible before an inky black chasm near the bow appeared in the distance. The entrance to the front cargo hold, site of the only evident bones from the shipwreck. Aaron thrust forward eagerly and entered the forbidden remains of the SS Jongala, where the wide ocean void was replaced by flaky walls of eroded steel. His hands were steady as he checked the EMF meter. The lights still glowed green. Nothing yet. 55 minutes, 23 seconds. Aaron began his sweep of the room. He wanted to save at least 10 minutes for a safe ascent, and the clock was ticking. Most of the contents within the cargo hold had long ago turned to sludge. The ground crawled with crustaceans and slithering sea snakes, but no matter how many times Aaron trekked back and forth, he saw no sign of human remains. His search continued so long, he began to worry the reports of bones might be a farce. He kept his breath steady while methodically scanning the floor to no avail. After making up his mind to quit the cargo hold to search elsewhere, an unnaturally straight object reflected off the beam of light. Aaron drew closer and saw a knob on the end of it. It must be the famed femur bone seen by the divers before him. The adrenaline rush returned, and he kicked towards the human remains without hesitation. Taking advantage of his buoyancy, he hovered several feet over the femur bone while checking his equipment. It would be difficult to discern ghostly voices of an underwater recording, especially over the rumbling of his regulator, but he checked on the EVP recorder anyway. The EMF meter was still in the green, so he brought the full spectrum camera to his face. Aaron took a dozen pictures of the femur bone and its surroundings, then shone the light in every direction to take pictures of the entire cargo hold. The pitch blackness of confinement impeded his flashlight, allowing less illumination than the infinite blue of the open sea. In the darkness, he waited. Ghost hunting was about patience, and he had been to enough haunts without sight or sound of a ghost for hours that he was well practiced in tenacity. 42 minutes, 28 seconds. The EMF lights blinked now. Aaron looked around expectantly, excited to get an alarm so quickly. But he was alone. The yellow lights turned back to green. 40 minutes, 2 seconds. A scratching sound reverberated through the water. Aaron could not sense which direction it came from. 36 minutes, 18 seconds. Aaron grew restless. He worried his dangerous descent had been in vain. 32 minutes, 43 seconds. The EMF blipped yellow again, but only for a moment. 20 minutes left. The Ongala groaned, its steel frame protesting against the watery grave. It was followed by a childlike cry for help. Aaron's skin tingled, and he swung the flashlight around, catching nothing but blackness. He stared down at the EMF meter, but it had gone dead. He knocked the side of it with his flashlight, trying to coax it to life. With a burst of radiance, a dozen red pinprick lights flickered in the dark. Warmth vanished from the water, leaving it icy cold. Aaron saw nothing supernatural with his naked eye, but still snapped dozens of pictures, hoping a glowing human figure or mystical ring of light would show up when he developed the negatives in the darkroom. 24 minutes, 12 seconds. The nauseating sensation of listening from one side to the other seized him. Childish cries for help came from every direction, and Aaron's blood chilled to the core. Despite his experience, Aaron's courage faltered. The EMF meter cranked back up, flashing red lights this time. Dread overcame him, and he headed for the hole in the deck, looking back one last time toward the abandoned bone. In the darkness, a pale face wavered like white silk in a breeze. Aaron stopped his ascent and grabbed the camera. This could be irrefutable proof of a haunting, guaranteeing him recognition in the ghost hunting community. The face disappeared in seconds, but Aaron hovered near the exit. Now that he was closer to his escape route, he felt safe, and decided to stay a few more minutes. The sight of a ghost had reinvigorated him, but the lights on the EMF meter went green, and the temperature of the tropical waters warmed. Shadows moved in the darkness, but when Aaron pointed his flashlight toward each anomaly, he saw only local sea creatures swimming past. A group of spotted manta rays glided overhead, just beyond the gaping hole of the cargo hold, causing a wavering in the still water. Aaron pointed his flashlight on their white undersides, watching the graceful undulation of their wings as they passed. 13 minutes, 3 seconds. Time to leave. Disappointed that 10 minutes passed and he'd seen no more signs of the supernatural, Aaron took a final look around the cargo hold. He swept the darkness with his flashlight one last time, then conceded his defeat and swam toward the gaping exit above. Aaron jerked in surprise when light flooded the chamber. The temperature plummeted, and in his shock, he missed the exit, hitting his head on the splintering roof. He blinked against the jolt of pain, then saw clearly the cargo hold, as it was in 1911, with over 100 passengers crouched on the floor in fear. The Yongala listed severely, groaning as it swayed from side to side. Aaron floated over the scene, an observer over the impossible vision of these doomed passengers, hiding from a storm in the bowels of their ship. Wails and crying filled his ears, echoing like the hollow sound of waves in a conch shell. Vertigo ripped through Aaron's senses. He couldn't tell whether he was seeing the ghost ship or the real Yongala. Aiming for what he hoped was the exit, Aaron kicked against the freezing water, trying to escape the pleas for help below him. Time was running out. He burst into the warmth of the open sea, and the sight of blue and yellow fish swimming through the gently waving fingers of a white coral brought him back to his senses. 7 minutes, 20 seconds. Back in the open sea, speed was the enemy. He must ascend slowly to avoid the pressure change tearing his lungs to shreds, so he pushed his fears deep inside to be dealt with later. Aaron kicked gently against the water, watching the wreckage of the Yongala disappear beneath his feet. He kept an eye on his depth gauge, fighting the urge to sprint to the surface. Aaron hovered at 15 feet, his final safety stop, watching the timer to make sure he stayed a full 5 minutes. His heart had slowed to normal. The world returned to what it should be, and with nothing to occupy him but his thoughts, Aaron's mood shifted from fear to excitement. All of his equipment was intact, and he felt sure of proving the wreck was haunted. 3 minutes, 23 seconds. With a final farewell to the deep blue beneath his feet, Aaron kicked toward the surface. He looked up, expecting the Mercury-shaped underside of his boat to come into view. But instead he saw the pearled, smoky form of a 120-foot ghost ship hovering overhead. His EMF meter shook free of its own accord, floated to his face, and reflected a dozen blinking red lights across his mask. The phantom Yongala capsized in the calm water, struck by an invisible wave, and descended upon Aaron. Water whirlpooled in an indomitable current, dragging him relentlessly toward the sea floor. The enormous pressure in his chest and ears was crippling, and the screams of 122 passengers lost at sea accosted him as the ghost ship crashed into its remains and disappeared, leaving Aaron alone in the dark at the bottom of the ocean. 22 seconds. Aaron sat on the deck of the SS Yongala, 65 feet down, breathing his last thin gasp of air. If he rose to the surface, the pressure would tear through the soft tissue of his lungs, and he would die in agony, alone on his boat. It was better to stay here. He released the waterproofing clasp of the EVP recorder, flooding its electronic insides with salt water, then popped open the film canister of his camera. The red sweep hand of the oxygen tank meter slipped to 0, and behind the plastic shield of his mask, Aaron's eyes filled with fear. He looked one last time at the endless expanse of the blue overhead, while the regulator slipped silently from his mouth. I love my son. I truly do. There's nothing in the world I would wish for than my parents, my wife, and, most importantly, my son. His name is Oscar, and he was a well-behaved child. Even at the age of 5, he knew better than to do wrong. That wasn't the only thing I loved about him. But it was his wild imagination that really amazed my wife and I. Ever since he was 3, he found his love of drawing pictures, really cute ones, to be honest. We'd usually find pictures of what we can make out as his own make-believe creatures, ones that Oscar had made up. He had different descriptions and stories for each one. It was really something quite extraordinary for us. For a few of his birthday parties, my wife and I thought about bringing his world of creatures to life by buying random party supplies and costumes to try and make a real-life representation of it. Oscar loved it, and we'd done 2 more birthday parties with the same theme. At those parties, we'd invite my work buddies' kids to have someone play with Oscar. Surprisingly enough, Oscar already has a few friends, especially one called Billy. Billy Hill was the son of one of the best guys I work with at my job as a car manufacturer, Sean Hill. Sean had a huge interest in heavy metal music, which is why he sometimes listens to music from his favourite bands while he's working. Just something to put out there. His son Billy had picked up on the interest in music that shouted to you. Basically the only music Billy and Sean would listen to. Like father, like son, right? Billy and Oscar's relationship was something special for Sean and I. Even my wife was glad our son had found his first new best friend. Sean usually came over to our house. He'd bring Billy with him. He only wanted to come over to play with Oscar. Sean and my wife and I would usually talk about what was going on in our lives, mostly about work. Billy and Oscar would be in Oscar's bedroom, either drawing pictures together or just playing with whatever toys they both got out. All of that, however, had stopped about a year later on Oscar's 5th birthday. My son wanted another fantasy-themed birthday party, so we'd given him one. After the cake and presents were given, Oscar continued playing with Billy outside. I started putting the leftover cake and ice cream away when I heard the back door open, followed by small footsteps. Looking over to Billy, walking into the kitchen where I was, towards me, and he had a strange look on his face. Billy had that expression where he was about to scream or cry, or something like that. Either way, it had me worried. "There's a man outside," Billy said, a quiet and shaky tone coming out of his mouth. I immediately ran to the window to look out at Oscar, and surprisingly, there was a man out there, standing in front of him. The man wore a dusty trench coat and leather work gloves, probably some homeless man or a drug addict. He stood in front of Oscar, who didn't look afraid at all. No, I know what I saw. He was smiling up at him. Oscar's lips didn't move at all. He was just looking up at the man, with that dimpled grin spread across his face. I ran out the door with a broom in my hand, the only thing I thought of grabbing in an instant. "Get the hell away from my son," I shouted at the man, who turned to look at me. He immediately ran around the other side of our house, and in an instant he was gone. I looked over to Oscar, who seemed merely confused. "Oscar, are you okay? Did that man hurt or touch you anywhere?" I asked him, staring at him in the eyes, and not taking my eyes off him. Oscar only stuttered, as if he couldn't get a reply out, but he did. "I'm fine, Daddy. He liked my picture." I looked down at a sheet of paper that had some sort of drawing on it. A new creature Oscar probably came up with, possibly. I picked it up to see for myself, and, well, I had no words to let out. This creature wasn't like anything he had ever drawn. In fact, this wasn't even a monster. It was what I could only assume is a little boy, his whole naked body covered in holes. Taking a closer inspection of the holes, I found out that they tried to represent faces. A little boy with faces all over its body. Each face seemed to be frozen in shock or fear, which made this thing look even more discomforting. "Oscar, get in the house," I told him, still looking at his drawing. Oscar got up and walked into the house, very silently, as I went in with him. I talked to my wife about what had happened outside right after, about that man trying to approach Oscar and what Oscar had drawn. She wasn't that concerned about the picture, for that's what she thought it was normal for a child to draw, something like a strange boy with faces all over its body. No, what concerned her was that he was left alone with a man who could have been a paedophile or a murderer of some sort, and that it was my fault I wasn't out there with him. Now, I remember at the time that I was in the house putting away ice cream and cake, but just the thought of what could have happened to Oscar had scared me the most. That night, before Oscar's bedtime, my wife and I had talked with Oscar about what had happened. "Oscar, can you please tell us what happened when you were outside with Billy?" I asked him, who was drawing a nice, new picture of his usual made-up creatures this time. "Am I in trouble, Daddy?" Oscar replied, looking up at us. "No, sweetie. You did nothing wrong. We just want to know what happened when you were outside with Billy," my wife said, reaching over to hold Oscar's left hand. "Me and Billy were playing, and then I saw this man walking up to us. Billy ran away, and he was talking to me. He's really nice," Oscar said, his other hand sketching all over the paper. "Did the man say anything to you?" my wife asked him, stroking his small hand with her thumb. "He said he wished he had a kid, and he wanted one like that," Oscar replied, pointing to the sketch I held in my hands. My wife and I looked at each other, then the picture that Oscar had drawn. We both looked back at Oscar, still scribbling some features on his new monster. It was nighttime, almost midnight, when I woke up with Oscar standing at the side of the bed with tears dripping down his cheeks. I wasn't able to fully comprehend what I was seeing as I sat up and comforted him in my arms. Oscar's crying had now softened into quiet whimpers. "Oscar, is everything okay?" I asked him. "Did you have another nightmare?" Oscar nodded his head, his lips quivering. "Do you want to sleep with us?" Oscar nodded again, sniffling as he calmed down and climbed into our bed, covering himself up. As he did so, I tried to get back to sleep, but I felt Oscar tap on my shoulder again. I turned over to look at him. He was still wide awake. "Yeah, buddy?" I asked him quietly. "Can I tell you what I dreamed about?" Oscar asked me. "All right, sure." "You know my best friend?" "Billy?" "No, my other best friend, the one in my picture." "Oh, yeah." I felt a bit unnerved just thinking about it. "He was trying to save me." "Save you from what, Oscar?" "That man." I immediately knew who he was talking about. "He took Billy away from me, and he told me he wasn't coming back." I jolted up, looking down at Oscar, who was already asleep. Those last words that came out of his mouth had my heart drop. It wasn't just what he said, but what I thought of when he said it. The man that approached Oscar out in the backyard. If he was really going to kidnap Oscar or Billy, that would have been a horrible thought. I tried to go back to sleep, but it repeated and repeated in my mind, still preventing me from closing my eyes, thinking that that man would appear in the bedroom and take Oscar away. After about an hour, I was able to fall asleep. And on that night, I had the same nightmare as Oscar. I remembered it taking place at the birthday party. Everything was normal. The kids were playing around, eating cake and ice cream. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, or so I thought. I was looking at Oscar, who was drawing pictures with Billy. Then I turned back to the crowd of kids, and I saw it. Oscar's best friend. The boy with faces all over its body. Except in reality, it looked a lot more twisted. A naked boy, who appeared to have the same hair as Billy, had faces of many other children stitched all around his body, looking like something Ed Gein would have created. He just stared at me, slowly walking up to me, as I could only stare back at him. "Call the police, mister. The man already took me and the others, and he made himself a child. We'll never grow up to be grown-ups like you did, ever. The man lives in the forest behind your house, in a small shed. He's going to take Oscar too, and you might never see him again. Keep him safe, so wake up now," the boy said, his voice sounding exactly like Billy's. I could only stand there, unable to think of what to do next. "Wake up now!" That was when I woke up and called the police, and told them everything. about the man who apparently lived in a forest that was in our neighborhood. A few minutes later, I'd gotten some texts from Sean. Many text messages to be exact. Each of them were either, "Call the police, my son is missing," or "I can't find Billy." My wife and Oscar woke up as I walked out of the bedroom to the front door. The police had arrived. They followed me from behind us, as they both wondered what was going on. I ignored them, trying to listen to what the police officers at the door had to say. They were able to find and capture the man, who supposedly was in the forest and lived in a small shed that they'd found. He didn't have a name, information unknown so far to them, but unfortunately, it was true. He had kidnapped a few children, including Billy Hill. Like what Oscar and the Thing had said, the man had made himself a child. But the man had admitted that he always wanted a child to raise and take care of. He did once have a wife, but every time they tried to have a baby, every child was miscarried. The man moved out of the house and ran away for that reason, and kidnapped as many kids as he'd lost the same amount of unborn lives. He mostly wanted a boy. That must have been the reason why Billy had to be the kid to stitch the faces onto, but it still doesn't answer why he had to be the one. My wife took Oscar into his bedroom, where he was able to fall asleep, hoping he wouldn't come out to listen to the truth. Sean was also able to come over, really upset about the current events that were happening. He couldn't stop crying, his hands covering his face as he wept loudly, being comforted by my wife, who was sitting on the couch. The one thing that really disturbed me the most about what the police told me was that they were able to find the bodies of all the missing children, even Billy. Every child, except for Billy, had missing faces. Possibly the flesh was torn or cut off. They also found Billy, who was dead in the shed the man lived in. His clothes were gone and his body found naked. All the children's faces had been stitched onto his body, exactly like the one in my dream and described in Oscar's picture. Well, I think it's time for me to introduce my first guest this evening, Mr. Davis. How are you doing?
What's up, guys? How's everybody doing? It's Mr. Davis here. I think I got a couple of stories you're going to like.
Well, I like the sound of that. I hope everyone else does too. Okay, over to you, man.
My wife and I went on a camping trip a while back. I'm not sure if we're ever going again, however, given what happened. The site we went to was one that was privately owned. It's just in the middle of a forest owned by some old guy. We got in contact with him and booked a week there. We only stayed for 3. The first few nights were totally fine. We laid out under the stars, talked about old times and when we first got together, all that mushy stuff. It was the following morning that things started to feel different. The fresh pine field air we'd grown accustomed to was now filled with a foul, rotten smell. I nearly vomited. "What the hell is that smell?" my wife said coming out of the tent. I'm not sure. I mean, we're not too far from the road. Maybe somebody hit a deer the other day and we got the downdraft. I scanned the tree line thinking about what could be out here. Would we wake up to a bear eating our leftovers? "Hey," my wife said. "It's gone." She sniffed the air a little more, then looked back at me, shrugging her shoulders. "That's kind of weird." I continued scanning the tree line, and far off, deep in the woods, I thought I saw something pale ducked behind the tree. It was a little unsettling, but I figured my eyes were playing tricks on me. I must have been pretty concentrated because my wife asked if anything was wrong. "Oh, no, I just thought I saw a deer or something." The smell came and went for the rest of the day, and there were some times while we were looking for firewood that I thought I heard something growling. When I looked around, however, there wasn't anything around. And I'm fairly sure my wife doesn't growl. The weirdest thing we experienced, however, was the second day. All throughout the day, we would experience a sense that everything went silent. I was the first to point it out. We were walking through the woods taking some photos the first time we experienced it. "Hey, babe." She turned around and raised her eyebrows as I asked, "What?" "Do you, notice anything weird?" She looked around before bringing her focus back to me. No?" I stared up at the trees above us. The leaves were swaying in the wind, and I could feel it, but I couldn't hear the rustling. "You okay, babe?" "Listen," I said. "You can't hear the wind, the birds, the bugs, nothing." She gave me that look again, but then stopped to listen. Her eyes widened as she realized I wasn't messing around. And that's when the smell came back, that rotten, vile smell. "Still think it's a deer?" she said. I shook my head and took her hand. "Come on, let's go back to camp." Halfway there, darkness had fallen, and all of a sudden the sound just seemed to turn back on. It didn't gradually return, it just came back. Back at the campsite, everything was trashed. Our tent was flipped over, the food was thrown all around the site, and there were deep claw marks around the fire. "What the hell?" I said. "Do you think we should leave?" It was extremely dark, even with a full moon, and I wasn't sure if we'd be able to make it out with just headlights. The trail here was riddled with potholes and mud that could cause you to slide off into the forest. I could see her contemplating what would happen if we stayed. The thing that did all this could come back, and judging by the marks near the fire, it could easily kill us. She opened up her mouth to speak, but was interrupted by a high-pitched guttural scream coming from the woods. I turned my attention to it for only a second before I turned back to her and said, "Find the keys and get the truck started." She ran over to the flipped tent to find her purse. I headed over to the fire to pull out one of the limbs we'd used to act as a torch. I figured if the thing that did all this was coming back, I'd be able to scare it off. I heard the scream again and saw that pale figure making its way through the woods. Soon it was in the campsite with me. It was disgusting to look at. Small patches of hair hung from its head. The claws were covered in dirt, and what looked like blood dripped from its mouth. I heard the car start, and I began running back to it, making sure to turn around every few seconds to make sure this thing wasn't tailing me. I swung the limb back and forth to keep it at bay until I could make it to the truck. I chunked the limb and managed to hit it. It screams out in pain, and me and my wife take off down the trail. The drive home was over 2 hours long, but we didn't stop. I did take over at one point so she could rest, but we felt like we needed to keep moving. I wanted us to be as far away from that thing as we could. We both dealt with nightmares for a long time. Even now, I have the occasional one, but it's very rare. I did take the time to call the old man who owned the property, but all I got was his voicemail. When I tried the second time, it said the line was disconnected. I'm not sure if this is connected with him in any way, and I don't care to find out. But I don't see how someone can let someone stay somewhere with that thing running around.
Wow, fantastic story there, Mr. Davis. I think you got another one lined up for us later, is that right? Oh, okay, great. Now, who else is joining me around the fire? Well, can you believe it? GM Danielson is here too. For those of you not familiar with his channel, where have you been? As soon as this little Campfire story collection gets finished, I want you to head over to his and Mr. Davis's channels immediately, okay? You're going to do that for me, right? Okay, GM Danielson, over to you, man.
It's not real, you know. I've heard what they've been saying on the news, and I know some of the southern states have been welcoming the extra boost in tourism. But it's not true. Damn it, it's not. I'm old enough to remember the last one. The sun blotted out of the sky 40-some-odd years ago. I remember looking up, wearing the collectible eyewear that Life magazine sent out to everyone. Look directly at it. We did. My God, we did. As the disc-shaped orb rolled over the big yellow star in the sky, we were forced to squint, but we saw it. The darkness that ensued was all-encompassing. A silence came with it, something I certainly did not expect at the time. As we watched the pitch-black disk that floated above us, hypnotized by the mid-afternoon queerness of it all, I heard the first of many screams. It was the shadows. Later, I heard tales of the first few that noticed, their shadow seemingly with a mind of its own, stretching out over the grass or pavement or dirt. They were cracking, the shadows, and there was a voice too. "Darkness," it whispered. "Darkness. Darkness." And then the voice said his name. Then it began to laugh even harder. Laugh at the morons that watched the eclipse with bated breath, laughing wholeheartedly, as if the voice was in on an old joke, older than time itself. That laughter, some of the ones that were lucky enough to survive it went on to a deluxe lifetime stay at the local asylum. Luckily, I was one of the lucky few, years of drilling and roadwork having dulled everything I heard into a very low roar. But I certainly remember his name. As the voice faded, the hands reached out through the shadows, just as they began to dissipate within the eclipse's lightless grasp. They looked more like talons than fingers as the elongated limbs reached forward, snagging anything and anyone, and all unassuming ankles in their grasp. And then they dragged them through. And I don't mean through like over. I mean like through the grass, the pavement, the dirt. Later I heard somebody refer to the shadows as a sort of gateway, some kind of interdimensional passageway or some crap. I don't know if I believe it, of course. The science types that showed up a few hours later told us it was a mass hallucination. Of course, that seemed just as far-fetched as a portal to hell. "No," they said. "That wasn't a hand reaching out that took you, brother. It was just an earthquake. It was all in your head." Of course. But this time I'll be waiting. When the hands, those wretched talons, begin to reach through their darkened doorway, I'll be ready. Ready for Mr. Black. That name, the one that drove the world mad. So this Monday, a fair warning. Don't look up. No matter what the news tells you, no matter what the instructions with your fancy new glasses tell you, no matter what your friends, your family, or Facebook insists you do, don't look up. Look down and be ready.
Well, what a fantastic story we had there. And I think you've got another one for us later on too, haven't you? Okay, very happy to hear that. Oh, well, I guess it's my turn, isn't it? Everybody warm enough? Come on, snuggle in. The fire is roaring. Plenty of beers to go round, if you're old enough, of course. And we've got some hot chocolates, some marshmallows ready for roasting on that fire. So, here we go with my second story for this evening. Names are made up for anonymity. I met Stacy, my wife, when I was in the 6th grade. We started officially dating in the 8th grade, and we dated all through high school. Then, just after graduation, she broke my heart. She wanted to go to college to find herself. I knew what that meant. I was taken completely by surprise, but she made it clear there was nothing I could do or say to change her mind. And believe me, I tried. More than I'd like to admit. So, just like that, it was over. I went to college close to our hometown, and she went to a college that was across the country in California. Selfishly, I told her we couldn't be friends when we broke up, as I knew that, well, that would help me to move on faster. Remaining friends would have kept the sense of hope alive, stringing me along. Over the next 2 years, I didn't hear from her at all. At one point, I did hear that her mother had passed away. Her father passed when she was young, but I never really found a good way to reach out. I went about my life, coasting through college, with a couple of short-term relationships here and there, but nothing serious. I just assumed she did the same. Then, one night, I went to a local bar with a few of my friends, and there she was. I was too embarrassed to admit it, but I didn't actually recognize her at first. It had only been 2 years, but her hair was now short. I already had a few drinks in me at that point. It was only after she made her way across the bar to hug me that I fully comprehended who she was. My friends and I would always joke that this bar was like a high school reunion every time we went there. Well, it was the only decent bar in the area, so, well, everyone went there. And this time was no exception. It struck me as odd that she was back in town mid-semester, as this seemed like a strange time to fly across the country to visit home. But we got to talking, and after a few drinks, I thought nothing of it. We really hit it off that night. It was like she'd never been gone. The feeling I had when I was with her. I joked about how she left me behind when she went off to college, hoping to ease any concern about whether I was upset, but she completely brushed it off. A little later, I brought up a story about a time when we were both in the 9th grade, and my mother dropped us off at a movie theater for a date. I could see the confusion on her face. She quickly explained that she'd been in an accident in her first year of college, and that she'd lost bits and pieces of her memory. The way she described it was that she basically couldn't remember some of the specific memories from her childhood, but she could remember faces and who people were. It sounded terrible, and I didn't want to prod too much, so I dropped it. After that night, we hung out again soon after, and then again. We picked up right where we'd left off in high school. A few weeks passed, and she eventually told me she wasn't going back to school in California. She wanted to stay here, which was great. Things progressed, and we eventually got married after I graduated. Things were so great. Years rolled by. We had 2 kids. She was a stay-at-home mom, and she was so good with the kids. There were some ups and downs over the years, but things were generally pretty good. And then I got an invitation to our 10-year high school reunion about a month ago. I thought about not going, but after some convincing from my friends at work, I decided to go. Stacy had also planned to come, but we ended up getting into a ridiculous argument tonight beforehand, so she stayed behind. I don't quite know how to explain what happened tonight at the reunion. I'm still processing it. It seemed like it was going to be pretty tame tonight. There were only about 40 of us that went. But then, somebody tapped me on the shoulder. I turned around, and I immediately felt what I can only describe as dread in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't quite comprehend what I was seeing. She looked so familiar. I knew exactly who she was, but my mind was having a hard time processing it. It was Stacy. The Stacy I dated in high school. The Stacy that dumped me after we'd graduated. She'd looked, well, exactly as I'd expect, just grown up. But she didn't look like my Stacy. This wasn't the Stacy I married. This wasn't the Stacy that was back at home. Oh my God, Steve. I can't believe it's been 10 years. How are you? Tell me about your life. You just kind of fell off the map. What happened? I'm great. I'm married now with 2 kids. How about yourself? Oh, I'm doing well. I fell in love with California during school and decided it was there I was meant to live. This is actually the first time I've been back since my mum passed 9 years ago. There really hasn't been any reason for me to come back since, well, until now. I ended the conversation there and immediately left. I'm now sitting outside my home in my car. The lights are off. I don't know who it is that I married, who I had kids with, but it is not Stacy, because that was definitely Stacy at the reunion. What's happening? I'm trying to piece this all together, but it's just too much. I don't think I can go in there. Okay, time again for Mr. Davis. Now you must have seen his channel, constantly putting out fantastic videos. You haven't? Well, you know I want you to make your way over there as soon as this video collection is finished, okay? Gonna do that for me, right? Good. Okay, over to you, Mr. Davis.
I've tried to justify what I did, but I can't. I was in a dark place during this period of my life, which is probably what attributed to the following experience. For context, I was heavily reliant on muscle relaxers and hallucinogens. This caused me to lose my financial aid for my college, and I eventually moved back home with my parents. My parents and myself were hopeful that I would get back on my feet soon. However, I couldn't hold a job more than a month, and I spent all my money on drugs. It only took 6 months before my dad said they'd had enough and kicked me out. I felt like I hated them at that point, but I knew that deep down it was the right thing to do. I was in and out of halfway houses for 2 weeks before they stopped accepting me as well. Homeless shelters turned me down, and all my friends were at college. One night, I devised the perfect plan. I'd just live in the woods. I'd go camping forever. This would help me get clean, seeing as I was broke as a convict, and I would be able to build up my life from there. I still feel terrible about what I did, but I went back to my parents' house that night and stole the family tent straight from the garage. I headed off into the woods soon after. The first week was the most dreadful thing I'd ever been through, while sober, at least. I was constantly rolling around in the tent, trying everything to keep my mind off the craving, but nothing worked. I devised a plan. My cell phone still had a few bars of battery left, so I called up the guy I used to buy from. To my absolute joy, he answered. I asked if he had anything left over from the previous deliveries, and luckily he did. He claimed it was something he'd never sold before, so he wasn't sure what it would do. He gave me a free trial, as he called it. Keep in mind, I didn't tell him my situation. I met up with him and picked it up and ran off back into the woods. Once I was back in the tent, I popped the hallucinogen and chewed up the baclofen. A few minutes passed and I felt it taking over. I laid out on the ground and looked up at the trees, letting it take me over. A handful of minutes passed before I really started noticing it. First, I could only move my head. I was a lightweight, so that wasn't uncommon, but what made it worse was that the hallucinogen started to kick in. The trees I was so mesmerized by began to morph and change. Lifting my head up and looking around, I saw roots bursting through the ground and making their way over to me. They grabbed at my ankles and held me down. I felt them crawling up my legs and arms. Soon, there was a large one wrapped around my throat and constricting my breathing. I fought, but they wouldn't let go. The moon morphed into a flame that was soon spreading across the canopy of the woods. The smoke crawled down the trunks of the trees and filled my lungs. I could feel the heat coming from the flames. I tried to scream out for help, but the roots around my neck and smoke in my lungs, I couldn't even get out a whimper. Eventually, I passed out. When I woke up, my throat burned and there was something, most likely bile, on the ground and on my face. My best guess is that I either got a bad batch or my situation played into the trip. Once I regained myself, I just started crying. I didn't know what else to do. On the last bar of battery, I called my dad and told him everything. I apologized for everything I did and admitted that I needed help. I couldn't deny it anymore. I told him where I was, and somehow he found me. I was taken to the hospital for an evaluation, and it turns out I had a seizure brought on by a combination of stress and the drugs. The doctor told me I was lucky that I didn't choke on the vomit. I put myself in rehab later that day, and after a long-fought battle, I became clean. As of this post, I've been clean for over 4 years. The trip I had in the woods was my last straw. I felt like it was an allegory for where my life was during that time. Everything was crumbling around me like the burning leaves of the trees, and I was holding myself down like the roots that grabbed my ankles, hands, and neck. I encourage anyone who may be going through something similar to look for help. There is always somewhere out there willing to help you, but they can't help if you've given up on yourself.
Whoa, another fantastic story. You're not getting too scared by these, are you? You're going to be able to sleep well tonight? Okay, remember they're only stories. It might not be so easy to remember after you've heard GM Danielson's next story. But you stick around. It'll be worth it, I promise. Okay, GM Danielson, over to you again, my man.
Son, we need to have a chat about internet safety. I slowly crumpled down onto the floor next to him. His laptop was open, and he was playing Minecraft on a public server. His eyes were locked into the action. Comments scrolled down the side of the screen in a chat box. Son, can you stop your game for a minute? He exited the world, closed the laptop, and looked up at me. Dad, is this going to be another cheesy, scary story? What? I faked hurt feelings for a second, then grinned at him. I thought you liked my cautionary tales. He grew up listening to my stories about children who encountered witches, ghosts, werewolves, and trolls. Like many generations of parents, I used scary stories to reinforce morals and teach lessons about safety. Single dads like me should use all the parenting tools at their disposal. He scrunched his face a little. They were fine when I was 6, but now that I'm getting older, they don't scare me anymore. They seem kind of silly. If you are going to tell me a story about the internet, can you make it really, really scary? I squinted at him incredulously. He folded his arms. Dad, I'm 10 and I can handle it. Okay, I'll try. I began. Once upon a time, there was a boy named Colby. His expression indicated that he wasn't impressed with the terror of the introduction. He sighed deeply and settled in for one of Dad's cheesy stories. I continued. Colby went online and joined several children's websites. After a while, he started talking to other kids in-game and on the message boards. He made friends with another 10-year-old boy named Helper23. They liked the same video games and shows. They laughed at each other's jokes. They explored new games together. After several months of friendship, Colby gave Helper23 6 diamonds in a game they were playing. This was a very generous gift. Colby's birthday was coming up, and Helper23 wanted to send him a cool present in real life. Colby figured it wouldn't hurt to give Helper23 his home address, as long as he promised not to tell it to any strangers or grown-ups. Helper23 swore he wouldn't tell anyone else, not even his own parents, and set about mailing the package. I paused the story and asked my son, "Do you think that was a good idea?" "No," he said, shaking his head vigorously. In spite of himself, he was getting into the story.
Well, neither did Colby. Colby felt guilty about giving away his home address, and his guilt began to grow and grow. By the time he put on his pajamas the next night, his guilt and fear were larger than anything else in life. He resolved to admit the truth to his parents. The punishment would be steep, but it would be worth it to have a clear conscience. He squirmed in his bed as he waited for his parents to tuck him in. My son knew the scary part was coming up. In spite of his tough talk, he leaned forward, wide-eyed. I spoke quietly and deliberately. He heard all the noises of the house. The washing machine bounced around in the laundry room. Branches scraped against the brick outside his room. His baby brother cooed in the nursery. And there were some other noises he couldn't quite pinpoint. Finally, his dad's footsteps echoed down the hall. "Hey, Dad," he called out nervously. I have something to tell you." His dad stuck his head in the doorway at a weird angle. In the darkness, his mouth didn't seem to move, and his eyes were all wrong. "Yes, son?" The voice was way off, too. "Are you okay, Dad?" the boy asked. "Uh-huh," sung the father in his strangely affected voice. Colby pulled his covers up defensively. Is Mom around?" "Here I am." Mom's head popped into the doorway below Dad's. Her voice was an unnatural falsetto. "Were you about to tell us that you gave your home address to Helper 23? You shouldn't have done that. We told you never to give out personal information on the internet." She continued, "He really wasn't a kid. Just pretended to be one. Do you know what he did? He came to our house, broke in, and murdered both of us, just so he could spend some time with you." A fat man in a wet jacket emerged into the child's doorway, holding 2 severed heads. Colby shrieked and gasped as the man dropped the heads to the ground, unsheathed his knife, and moved into the room to work on the boy. My son screamed too. He twisted his hands defensively over his face. But we were just getting started with the story. After several hours, the boy was almost dead, and his screams had become whimpers. The killer noticed the wailing of a baby in another room and removed his knife from Colby. This was a special treat. He had never murdered a baby before, and he was excited about the prospect. Helper 23 left Colby to die and followed the cries through the house like a homing beacon. In the nursery, he walked to the crib, picked the baby up, and held it in his arms. He moved towards the changing table to get a better look, but as he held the baby, the crying died down. The baby looked up and smiled. Helper 23 had never held a baby, but he gently bounced it in his arms, like a pro. He wiped his bloody hands on the blanket so he could stroke the baby's cheek. "Hey there, sweet little guy." The beautiful rage of sadism melted into something warmer and softer. He walked out of the nursery, took the baby home, named him William, and raised him as his very own. After I finished the story, my son was visibly shaken. Between ragged staccato breaths, he stammered, But Dad, my name's William." I gave him a classic dad wink and tousled his hair. "Of course it is, son." William ran up the stairs to his bedroom in a fury of sobs. but deep down, I think he liked the story.
Whoa, I don't know about the rest of you, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to sleep tonight after these scary stories. Well, we're just about coming to the end of this collection of stories, and I think it's only fair, as the host, that I round things off. Okay? Everybody ready? Here we go. The goldfish was the first thing to die. And goldfish die sometimes, right? That's no reason to suspect foul play. Certainly no reason to suspect the children had anything to do with it. Only, then all the class potato plants died. The class project, shriveled up and blackened and dead. The kids said the plants looked just like dead snakes. You know kids, they've got such vivid imaginations. Miss Robbins died next. She had a heart attack right there in class, and the kids just sat there and watched. They found her dead with a phone in her hand, the line cut clean in two. Must have been some kid playing with the scissors, right? The substitute broke her leg on the way to work. Slipped on a patch of ice, would you believe it? Had to have surgery to get it fixed. There was a complication, and she died on the table. Too much anesthesia. The class pen pal stopped writing back. When the administration tried to contact the other school, nobody answered the phone. Maybe the secretary was let go. Darren Anderson found the abandoned church in the woods. He said he found it by the smell. The place was littered with torn-up animal carcasses. We always thought there were coyotes in those woods. Can't let kids go playing there anymore. The town pets started to disappear. We figured the coyotes must be coming into town. People started carrying their guns with them. Never know when you might see a coyote. Darren Anderson had his throat cut, and his children disappeared. Could have been those child kidnappers. Sometimes they come up from the border and take kids back down to Mexico. Paula Torini vanished too, but they found her intestines smeared on the ceiling. The kids were gone, and there was a trail of blood leading out to the forest. The town police started shooting coyotes on sight. The kids sang nursery rhymes about Miss Robbins, Darren Anderson, and Paula Torini. They sang about the devil's hands, dragging us down to hell. The school banned the nursery rhymes. It didn't help. People barricaded themselves in their homes. The phone lines all went dead. Some people tried to leave, but their cars went off the road. People fell asleep at the wheel or blew a tire. It happens. On the night of June the 7th, the kids all disappeared. Bloody trails out to the woods, but the church was burnt to ash. They couldn't figure out the cause. The fire marshal said lightning must have hit the roof, set the dry wood off. After the kids left, the adults all drifted out of town. No sense in sticking around. It's the strangest thing. I can't remember the place's name. People forget things, I guess. The plants in my garden died last night. Went all black and shriveled up. Looked like dead snakes. Sometimes at night, I can hear the voices of children singing nursery rhymes. They sing about Miss Robbins, Darren Anderson, and Paula Torini. And then they sing about me. Howls and screeches greeted David when he stepped outside, as did some of his men who waved or gave a friendly hello. Many were hard at work, either transporting large crates filled with squealing livestock, or reinforcing the barbed wire surrounding the farm. While the work might have been tough, David paid and treated them well. Initially, he'd had his doubts about opening a pig farm out in the middle of nowhere, Arkansas, but in the end it paid off. Dressed in a t-shirt and trunks, David made his way to a baby blue Mercedes. Business had been booming for the past couple of years, and this was one of the few perks he enjoyed. Every now and then, however, he liked to take some time away from work to enjoy a jog. "Now, let's see what's on the radio," David said to no one in particular, before backing out of the farmstead's lengthy driveway. A few catchy tunes caught his ear, followed by some local news. The anchorman spoke of a string of grisly deaths at the hands of a wild animal, but the police were confident it would be caught. When the fancy automobile came to a halt, David exited the car. Not only were there very few folks present, but the park itself was shrouded by a vast forest on all sides, except for the entrance. Furthermore, it wasn't a very popular area, and not on any major roads, making it quite a scary place to be at night. Unlike the other runners, David preferred to visit when there weren't many people around. Luckily for him, fewer people had been showing up by the day, worried that they too might end up spirited away. Upon quickly surveying the park, the farmer saw a couple of people, most of whom were in groups of 2 or 4, probably as a safety precaution, and they seemed to be leaving anyway. One person, it seems, was sitting alone. A 15-year-old boy of African-American descent. His rather thin build and youthful features suggested someone several years younger. There was something odd about him, though. Whether it was the coat he wore or not, David couldn't be sure. It wasn't cold, but the weather was fair, and it was a very light jacket at that. There was nothing he wasn't prepared for, so it mattered not. He sat a great distance away from the others, with earbuds half sunken into his hair. Dangerously far, some would say, but the youth didn't seem to mind. Do you have the time?" Unfazed by the sudden emergence of another person, the boy simply retrieved his phone. It's about 5:21 p.m., he replied in a fittingly little boy voice. With the ice broken, David engaged his new friend in conversation, all the while keeping track of the ever-dwindling number of people. "So, what are you listening to, anyway?" asked David. Random shit from the internet. It's the playlist of my soul," replied the boy. A roar of laughter emerged from David before he gave the park one final sweep. His laugh, while genuine, masked a blacker purpose. When everyone departed save for the adult and the boy, David's demeanor darkened. "You know, kid, I like you, but—" "But?" asked the boy, puzzled by David's revelation before the older man asked him his name. "Alexander, but most people just call me Alex." Unsure of what else to do, he answered the adult's request with an obvious hesitation in his voice. David smiled wickedly before elaborating further. "But I am hungry." Alex would have run at that point if he weren't cowering before the sight of David's true nature. Brown irises sunk into a rising sea of red until only a deep crimson remained. Fair skin followed suit with its own transformation, becoming leathery and turning the color of ash. David's muscles flexed, expanding outward into almost cartoonish proportions. Bones snapped and twisted as unnatural forces reshaped his musculature into something more akin to a large canine than that of a man. His ears curled inward before flattening, and extending upward until they resembled a wolf's. It was around the time that the farmer's teeth sharpened to a knife-like point that Alex found the courage to flee. Right before he could witness coarse black fur consume the man's body, completing his turn. Fueled by fear and adrenaline, Alex ran into the forest behind him. David, on the other hand, simply smirked as he saw his prey foolishly run ahead. Whatever salvation the boy sought, he wouldn't find it there. The farmer's toothy maw overflowed with saliva at the thought of sinking his teeth into the youngster. After fully finishing his rebirth, the newly inhuman beast wasted little time in running after him. He knew these woods quite well, so young Alexander's chances of escape were non-existent. It took mere minutes for their game of cat and mouse to end in a clearing. The newly reborn David stood before Alex, claws and fangs on display, with a feral growl in his throat. However, it suddenly dawned on him that the boy's face no longer read of dread, but delight. This both puzzled and angered the transformed father, who merely snarled in return, preparing to pounce. At least he would have, if not for what happened next. Alexander's coat started to violently shake, almost as if something was concealed beneath it. "Want to see?" he asked the werewolf, who was suddenly unsure of what the youth was up to. Without hesitation, he tore off his jacket and shirt, uncovering countless small, tumorous growths that peppered his tiny body, all of which pulsated with a sickly green brilliance, covered in a veiny network that scoured the boy's tummy and chest. Most disturbing were the 12 that resembled gaunt human faces, each more withered and ghastly than the next. Adding to the sheer eeriness of their existence were the characteristics they held, such as moles or teeth. The grotesque things trembled, parting the layers of cancerous tissue where eyes would be, revealing black pools. Upon seeing the beast before them, their collective expressions twisted into a pained rage. In his need to deny the reality before him, David contemplated if Alex was wearing some sort of elaborate costume. However, when the living lump spoke, shock grasped the pig farmer, freezing him in place. Pus pooled at the corners of their mouths, dripping down like saliva. "Join us in silence," they communicated in unison, speaking in an ancient rasp that wavered between male and female. "Within us there is no pain, no death. We promise only everlasting peace," said the many-headed things, undulating with anticipation. Imbued with supernatural haste, 6 of the tumors flew from the teenager's body, sinking their teeth into a stunned David. Wrinkled mounds of fat plastered in infected sores served as their heads, and their necks were narrow columns of flesh tied to Alexander's belly. In case you were curious, I am a mutant created for the sole purpose of terminating creatures like you. I was sent here to eliminate whatever was threatening the civilian population in this area. After a little investigation, it turned out that threat was you. I just didn't want any witnesses," Alexander said, with a notable arrogance in his words. Acting on the teen's command, the creature's worm-like bodies expanded and retracted as they pumped some unknown fluid into the unfortunate man-beast. From the horror's mouths flowed a river of thick, viscous yellow sludge, which upon contact with the werewolf's skin burned him. Searing hot mucus melted away fur, eating its way through layers of tissue and tendon. The surges of pain from the abomination's bites seemingly kick-started David's brain, awakening him from his trance. Instinctively, the farmer attempted to bite through the neck of the monstrosity closest to his right, causing the young boy to tense up in pain. Seeing the child falter, David used this opportunity to tear the vile extremities from his form. Clawed digits found homes in inflamed meat, flailing wildly about. It was all he could do to try and escape. Screw this kid, the farmer thought. He'd rather be starving and alive than dead. Worry replaced Alexander's confidence, and he hurriedly pieced together a plan of action. After regaining his composure, the teen willed more of his malignant growths to act. From the maws of the remaining 6 faces emerged swarms of insectoid-like things. Held aloft by small wings, their forms were coated in throbbing blood vessels. A small hole resided upon their underbellies, from which a throng of antennae hung. They bore a great resemblance to butterflies, only their flight lacked the elegant grace of such a creature. Instead, the horde's flight was marked by screams. Matching the swiftness of their comrades, they had already overtaken David, pouring into any visible orifice. His nostrils and mouth were flooded with them by the dozens. The feelers at their bellies anchored into the werewolf's insides, filling them with eggs. Shortly after being laid, they exploded into thousands of carnivorous larvae. As the monsters chewed away at his intestines, David knew it was over. The man-beast couldn't even muster an anguished cry due to the living nightmares clogging in his throat. When there was no longer any space inside the man's head, parent and larvae alike spilled forth from his skull. "Whoa, that was bomb as fuck," Alexander said before his posterior collided with the ground. "Hurry and eat him up," barked the teen at his inhuman appendages. More than happy to comply with their freshly pubescent overlord, the creatures hastened their pace, greedily devouring the corpse's remains. A buzzing in his pocket tore Alexander's attention away from the fuzzy mess before him. "Hello?" he answered, his voice losing its youthful luster in favor of a more serious tone. "Yes, I have neutralized the threat, and now I'm moving on to the farm." So a little story there from Dr. Creepen's Vault, the subreddit I set up so I could read your stories. If you've got something you'd like me to read, then that's the place to put it. Okay, now over to one of my inspirations, one of the people that really helped me get started in the narration business. None other than Mr. Let's Read. Okay, over to you, man.
These experiences have confused and befuddled me for years. Being somewhat logical and searching for answers to events, I'm torn between what my logical mind is stating and what my senses have defined as truly paranormal. There are several members here who can identify with the ability to see spirits with the mind's eye, and it's this ability that has me questioning my logic. We all know about sleep paralysis and the dreamlike hallucinations one can have upon waking and finding oneself without the ability to move or speak. But what about when it occurs prior to falling asleep? Perhaps I should elaborate. There have been times when soon after I lay down to sleep, sometimes only seconds after, I can visualize and sense a presence. Normally, he is standing close behind me, although many times I've seen him standing in a doorway to the room I'm in. He is who most of us call the Hat Man, and he gives off a very terrifying vibe. He is pitch black, wears a wide-brim hat and a trench coat. He never moves, neither closer nor further away. Sometimes, I lie awake trying not to close my eyes because I know what's coming next. Soon after the visualization, my ears begin to ring, my head starts to buzz, and from there the buzz takes over my body and sends me into paralysis. I feel like he's trying to gain access to my innermost thoughts and emotions. Not possession, mind you, but more like being read. I should mention that one of my biggest fears is being smothered or drowned, and the feeling I get during an episode is that of being buried alive. Not the physical sensation of pressure, but that I'm running out of air. I've had these episodes most of my life, way before I knew what a shadow person or who the Hat Man was. Words can express the fear that overtakes me when I hear the activities of others in the area and am powerless to alert them. There have been times when the ringing in my ears begin, then the vision. The only time I can control the progress of the paralysis is during the ear ringing. Once the buzz comes, it's too late. I haven't had an episode in quite a while, but I feel it's because my discovery on how to gain control of the situation. Once I learned how to snap myself out during the ear ringing, the occurrences became fewer and fewer and eventually stopped altogether. Just talking about this makes me feel the sense of a presence. I will say no more, but I can already hear the ringing.
Fantastic little story there. Thank you so much. I think you're going to do another one for us later on, aren't you? Okay, that's great. Now, delighted to introduce you all to Elize Alexis, a fellow educator just like me. So, big props to her, and she has got a fantastic story to tell you right now. You all ready? Hey, come on, come in a little bit closer. The fire's lovely and warm. That's it. There you go. Okay, over to you, Elize.
Hey everyone, the name's Margot. Well, that's my middle name anyway. I can't use my first name for safety reasons. In fact, everyone's name in this internet tale of horror will be disguised. But that doesn't mean my experience is a fabricated one. Quite the contrary, really. Most of the deep web stories you hear or read about are, in fact, strictly synthetic, but not this one. Before I begin, it's important that you understand that I am a gamer girl, and if any of you know a lick about the gaming world, it has a history of not being particularly kind to its members of the female persuasion. At the time of this story, in 2015, I had just moved out of the dorms to finish my senior year in an apartment only a few miles from my university, and my roommate happened to be my cousin, Logan. Logan and I were only a month apart age-wise. And since we both grew up gaming together, we figured living together wouldn't be that far-fetched. But one thing about living with a boy is you get to meet all of his boy friends. No pun intended. But one of his friends that I met was named Nikolai. Well, maybe not met. See, Nikolai was not someone I knew in person. Logan and he met on WoW, or World of Warcraft, while gaming online. I personally am more into the console systems like PS4 and Xbox, but I did dabble with the PC gaming world from time to time. Logan knew Nikolai before we moved in together, so at first, I didn't find anything strange about them constantly playing online with one another. They frequented each other's guilds with multiple WoW characters, and often were in chat rooms and lobbies on Call of Duty. But Logan and Nikolai's relationship grew very strange. Even after playing for 7 or 8 hours straight, I would find Logan on his PC still playing with Nikolai. And yes, it's true, long hours for gamers isn't strange by itself, but what made it strange was that he was only playing with Nikolai, and oftentimes he would play for 12 to 14 hours straight. The rare times I hopped onto my own PC and tried to invite Logan to a lobby with our friends, he would decline or mostly just not even respond. I tried to talk to Logan about it several times, but he insisted that nothing was going on. Actually, he even told me that Nikolai had a sister, and that his sister wanted to play with me. At first, I declined. Logan kept pressuring me into it as the weeks went on, but I never gave in. I'm not one of those people that wants to make friends over the internet. I much prefer human contact. However, Nikolai and his sister must have had other plans. Only about a month after Logan tried to convince me to meet Nikolai and meet his sister, I received a text message from a number I didn't recognize. And of course, like most people do, I ignored it. I don't really give those types of messages my attention. Either I know you or I don't. I continued playing my game when all of a sudden my phone went off again. It was a message from the same number. Hesitantly, I opened it, and the message said, "Hi, I'm Nick's sister." Confused, bordering on angry, I reread the message over and over again. I told Logan I had no interest in speaking to Nikolai or his sister. I didn't want to play any games with them, join any lobbies, or share any IDs. Yet Logan gave them my number. Why? I sat down, prepared to respond with a curt, "Fuck off." But then I received another message from her. This time, the message only contained a link. Well, I could tell it was a link. It was a really weird link, though. The URL had no www on it, no .com, .net, nothing. Actually, it looked more like a series of letters and numbers. As soon as I got done reading it, another message followed. "Use it." I thought about calling for Logan, but I wasn't sure if he'd hear it as the speakers were blaring through the walls. I hesitated for a moment, but then decided to put the link into my browser anyway. When it finished loading, I noticed it opened to a site that looked like a forum. The background was red and the lettering blue, but only one of the topics worked. It was called "Let's Play a Game." A bit on the nose, if you will, but it still piqued my curiosity. I heard a ping again and went back to my phone. It was a message from Millie, and it said, "See you soon." So I sent Logan a message to come to my room immediately, and that it was an emergency. As I waited for him to respond, I clicked on that topic. A single question was asked. "Want to play a game?" Now, admittedly, I was getting nervous. Most anything that makes such corny movie references aren't that serious. But the mysterious message, the form and its weird coloring, the random file, it all seemed so planned and meticulously so. I tried to exit my browser, but the X button wouldn't work. I then hit the escape several times and tried the good old Control-Alt-Delete formula. Nothing. I don't know if this was out of pure curiosity or entrapment, but I hesitantly clicked the question. The author's name was blocked, but there was yet another link. I clicked it, and for a moment my computer froze. I tried clicking on things, moving my mouse, everything, but that screen wouldn't budge. I noticed the noise from Logan's room had stopped only seconds before he swung my door open. "What?" I looked over at him. He had his headphones around his neck and a controller in his hand. I put my fingers to my lips, motioning for him to be quiet. I'm not sure why, but I had this strange feeling that he and I were being watched. "Hey, what's going on with your computer?" He pointed to my screen. I had forgotten about it. I looked back and saw the screen was flashing. A large green loading box had suddenly appeared. It read, "Game loading." Then, without warning, the screen goes black. A few seconds pass. The screen opens again. It's a screen to what looks like a girl's birthday party. A digital birthday party. There's a large cake, party favors and decorations, and a present table. Suddenly, it was a message from Millie, and it said, "See you soon." And then suddenly, the screen zoomed in into the gift table, which was littered with boxes and packages perfectly wrapped with bows on top. 3 presents jumped off the table and onto the screen. It read, "Select your gift." Logan reached over behind me to try to move the mouse, but again, nothing happened. I then noticed that the gifts were labeled 1, 2, and 3. I chose 3 as it was purple, one of my favorite colors. The other 2 boxes disappeared, and the third fled to the bottom corner of the computer. Then 3 more appeared. I turned to Logan nervously and said, "Your turn." Logan tapped the 1 button, a blue and yellow box, and again, the boxes left with the number 1 box settling next to the 3 I had previously chosen. The last set of 3 were all black boxes with red decorations. One had a spade, the next had a heart, the last had a diamond. We chose the heart, and the other 2 boxes, as before, vanished. "What is this?" Logan whispered. "How should I know? Your friend's sister sent me the link." Logan laughed. "No, seriously, What is this? I didn't take my eyes off the screen. I am serious. Millie sent me this and asked if I wanted to play a game. Logan stopped laughing. Wait, are you serious? How? I don't know. She sent me some text message through some weird number I've never seen before. Don't give out anything about me to creepy internet people that I don't know. We sat there for a moment, watching as the presence began rotating in a circle around the screen. That's when Logan said it. Margot, I never gave Nikolai your name. That's when a loud bell rang from my computer. The presence has settled. 3, 1, heart. My box popped open with a spray of confetti. Out of it came a knife. It had the number 9 on it. Then Logan's box opened. A saw. It had the number 4 on it. And then finally, the heart. But instead of confetti, digital blood ran out. And then a power drill came out, with a skull and crossbone on it. What the fuck is this shit? What kind of game did Logan try to invite me to? Then, my screen goes black again, and suddenly reopens with a look into a dark room. The room itself is kind of hard to describe. There's nothing really remarkable about it. It was a room that looked like it was tiled, possibly colored, but I'm not really sure as there was a black filter displayed over it. The floor was also tiled, but other than that, there was nothing special about the room. But there was about what was in it. In the middle of the room was a puddle, and in that puddle was a wooden chair, and strapped to that wooden chair was a woman sitting next to a small table with some sort of box. She looked to be in her 30s. She also looked to be completely terrified. She had obvious scars on her legs and arms. Her eyes were sunken in, and even though it was from a distance, it was clear she was some type of druggie or alcoholic. She was wearing a cut-up tank top, and I think a skirt with a pair of those trashy high-heeled platform heels. Then, a man walked from behind the camera. He's wearing all black jeans, from his shoes to his jacket, and his mouth is covered with a black bandana and beanie. I immediately started getting a sinking feeling and began to try to exit out of the screen again. But nothing happened. The guy who had been stroking the gagged woman's hair then approached the camera and began wagging his finger in our face. I continued to tap the escape button till Logan grabbed my hand. "Stop," he whispered. "He can see you." I looked up and noticed that the green light for my webcam was on, and that they had indeed been watching us. First, the man picked up a knife. Logan and I watched as he went over to the woman. He then tapped the box next to her, revealing that it was actually a clock, a timer to be more precise. He continued clicking until it stopped at 9 minutes. He stood behind her and hit a button on the clock, and it began to count down. The next 9 minutes were the most horrifying moments of my life. I watched, listened, as the woman let out muffled shrieks with each slice of the blade. It wasn't a small one either. It looked to be one of those large kitchen knives that only professional chefs and butchers use to get a clean cut. I, at the very least, tried to turn the sound off, but that didn't work either. Then, after what seemed like a century, the 9 minutes were finally over. The man walked back to the camera and a message popped up in the bottom corner. Next gift. Logan asked which wire was the power cord so maybe we could unplug it, but I told him not to. It wasn't that I wanted to continue watching this, but there had been a couple times when my wires were literally crossed and my computer lost all of its data when suddenly snatched from its power source. I didn't want to lose any information on this link or site in case we may need it to get the police involved. The computer dinged with another message. Call the police and die. And I forgot they could see us, but it hadn't occurred that they could actually hear us too. The man then picked up the saw. The saw had a 4, and he clicked the timer to the number 4. He began untying her platforms and tossed them to the side. Then, he hit the start button. As the clock began to count down, he took the saw to her foot. For the first minute, he seemed to be playing with her. He dragged the saw up and down her leg on the flat side gently, even pushing it up her skirt. Then, when it hit the 3-minute mark, he flipped the saw and smashed it down on her toes like a hammer. We heard her scream against the gag as he frivolously moved the saw back and forth, cutting through her skin, muscle, and bones of all 5 toes on her left foot. Fortunately, or as fortunate as this could get, this task took the entire 3 minutes, unlike the sadistic knife slicing. She wasn't completely dismembered, but she did lose a couple toes. The man then walked back to the camera. I felt Logan put his hand on my shoulder as he knelt next to me. I could hear his ragged breathing in my ear. The man reached behind the camera and pulled out a drill. This drill had a bunch of hearts plastered on it, with a skull and crossbone. He also picked up a towel and began wiping her down. I felt something cold and wet fall down my shoulder. I didn't have to move to realize it was Logan's sweat. His hand had become disgustingly clammy against my bare shoulder. I myself was getting hot with fear. But what really made this strange was the introduction to the next person. The camera jiggled for a moment, and then I saw a woman walk out, coyly, almost with a Harley Quinn sway. She was dressed in all black too, wearing skin-tight leather pants and a jacket. Her hair was tied into a tight bun on top of her head, and she was wearing a mask. The same mask as Dollface from that Twisted Metal game. Anyway, once he was done wiping her off, the man handed the woman the power drill. She stepped behind their victim and put the drill next to her ear. She periodically turned it off and on, torturing her with the mechanical sounds of the power drill. I hadn't noticed, but they had set the timer. I didn't see him set it, but I noticed it was already down to the last 10 seconds. I watched as the woman crouched behind her, and as the last second dinged, I heard the power drill start, and then witnessed a small drill twist and push through the left side of the woman's chest. She fidgeted for a minute, and then slouched. She was dead. The woman and man then, holding hands, walked to the camera. They stared into it until a message popped up. "Let's play again sometime, Logan." That confirmed it. They could see us. How else would they have known Logan was there when the message was received on my computer? My screen then went black. I saw the computer began to reboot from the beginning. I logged into my computer, trying to get our story together with Logan and trying to convince him to notify the police, when I noticed my entire computer was wiped. Literally everything was gone. My games, my Microsoft Office applications, all my internet browsers, my kitten background. Gone. My computer was a black screen, save the plain blue background, and that lonely start button at the bottom. I turned to Logan. "Who is Nikolai? What have you been doing on that computer?" Logan had darted out of my room. I followed him, demanding that he tell me what he was doing. He was unplugging everything. His PS4, his Xbox, and then lastly, his PC. He then grabbed his PC and, what I guess was out of disbelief and pure confusion, opened the window to our third-story apartment and chucked his tower out of the window. Logan then turned to me and told me to never call the police, and we had to keep this to ourselves. I packed my things that night and went to go stay with my parents for the rest of the week. I didn't want to be in my room after that happened, but I knew I had to go back. I couldn't break the lease if we had only been there for a month, and I didn't want to leave Logan by himself. But when I returned, Logan revealed why he smashed his own computer. Nikolai had apparently sent Logan a link that same morning. Logan, though, refused to open it. Why? Well, apparently, one of Nikolai's hobbies was creating his own personal games. He liked to send these games to Logan for him to try out, kind of like demos. But the last few of these games Nikolai had created for Logan to play began to get entirely too creepy. He said one game was very pornographic and snuff rated. Another involved dismembering children in a twisted 2D download. But the final straw for Logan was the last game. It was called Cannibal's Delight, where apparently the user was able to slice up a single person and serve them to the customers out in the dining area. Almost like Diner Dash if you ever played that. Logan chose not to click on the link because he had planned to cut off ties with Nikolai after such disturbing downloads, which is why he believed the link was sent to me. Now, how Nikolai got my information, neither one of us ever found out. Despite what most people think, gamers don't necessarily know all the tips and tricks to hacking the deep web and the online black market. If it's not a game, then quite honestly, we don't care. But the number that sent me the message was no longer working. We believe it was one of those trash phones, and we didn't have any evidence of what happened anyway, and the URL on my phone didn't work anymore. Plus, if he was able to find out my name, then surely he'd be able to find out where I lived. But I didn't know Nikolai was that twisted. I mean, I knew something was wrong about the unnatural friendship between him and my cousin, but had I known those links led to the games like that, I never would have downloaded it. I decided to let this message out because I want there to be some trace of what happened to this woman. I don't know her backstory, but she was a family member to someone. And I also want everyone to tread more carefully when trekking through the internet, especially through something so seemingly innocent like online gaming. Be careful of who you meet. You never know what kind of game they'll want you to play next.
Oh, another fantastic story for you. Now, straight back over to Let's Read. I think you've got one more for us tonight, haven't you? Yes, here we go. Okay, over to you.
It was June 2014 in Los Angeles, California. I was sleeping on the top part of my bunk bed. I was 13 and hadn't had much experience with the supernatural or the paranormal before. I was lying on my back, and my knees were up and my feet flat on the mattress. I was slowly falling asleep when I wanted to change positions, but found that I couldn't. I tried laying my legs flat down, but I still couldn't. I didn't have a blanket on me, so it started to get a little cold. I remember wanting to call out to my mom in the next room, but couldn't speak. I stayed like that for a few minutes, and during those few minutes it started to get very hard to breathe. My breathing slowed down, and my heart was beating incredibly fast. I felt pressure on my chest, but saw nothing there. Once I was let out of this strange control, something told me to look down at my room floor, and I remember seeing a shadow figure. The night light in my room was on so I could see it clearly. It was like a shadow, and it was male. He was wearing a suit and a hat like a 1940s businessman, and in a blink of an eye, he was gone. I had these experiences more often after that, but I never saw another shadow figure. I remember one time hearing thumps in the wall, but I always just thought it was the neighbors, but it was in the early AM hours, so it couldn't have been. I researched this and found the old hag syndrome, but I'm still not sure what it was.
Ooh, another fantastic little story there. You know what? I think as the host, it's only fair that I round things off this evening. So here we go. Last story from me. Chris sat alone in a room, staring at the metal door that stood just a few feet in front of him. It was covered in a thin layer of rust, making it look brown, with a texture like sandpaper. A small hatch at the bottom of the door was just wide enough to fit small things like food and clothes in. The rest of the room was grey. A small black camera was perched in the top right corner, facing Chris. It had a small crack at the corner of the screen, and right below it was a pile of multicolored toys, broken and abandoned. There was also a small twin-size bed with sheets and a blanket that barely gave him any cover for warmth. To the left of him was a large crack on the wall made of what looked like concrete. Chris sat in the center of the bed, rocking back and forth while staring at the door, counting on par with every time his torso went backwards, then forwards. 1053. 1054. 1055. 1056. When Chris reached the number 1100, he stood up and jumped at the door just as the hatch opened and a small paper tray of food came through, containing nothing but a hamburger and 3 fries. Chris stuck his hand in the hatch just as the person on the other side of the door was about to slam it shut, but instead it hit his hand, stopping it from being closed. "Where am I?" yelled Chris to the person. The other person just ignored him and kicked his hand and then slammed the hatch on him. Chris jerked his hand from all the pain and heard the hatch slamming closed. It echoed in the air, bouncing off the walls, mocking him. Chris stood up again and looked down at the small tray of food resting by his feet. They'd been feeding him less and less in the last couple of weeks. But Chris only thought of the food as him giving up to the people who kept him prisoner. So he kicked the tray into the side of the room at the corner of the left wall, allowing all the food from it to fly everywhere. Then he sat down on his bed and held up his hand with all 5 fingers outstretched. Then 4, 3, 2, 1. As soon as Chris finished his countdown, a voice coming from an intercom that he could not see started to speak. Its voice was a man's, but it didn't seem human. Its voice was monotone and emotionless. As it spoke, a couple cracks could be heard in his voice, but Chris couldn't tell if it was the speakers or just the way the man spoke. "Today we are learning about..." The man paused, as he always did, and at the same time Chris and the speaker said, "Pythagorean theorem." Chris heard the same lesson over and over for the past couple of months now, replaying the message every day, causing Chris to go more and more insane each time. Until, by now he'd heard it so much that he could speak alongside it word for word. In 569 BC, a man named Pythagoras discovered a strange similarity with some of the right triangles he looked at. Chris looked around the room while stating the history math lesson until his eyes rested upon the small pile of broken toys sitting near his legs. Then his eyes slowly looked up to the camera that perched in the corner ceiling just above the toys. Chris remembered when he was 4 and he first woke up in this room. He saw all the toys, shiny and new, and he played with them for hours on end, letting his imagination go wild. His favorite toy was a small, plastic yellow submarine. He loved the toy so much that he used to believe that he was in a yellow submarine sailing away to paradise. It only took him 4 years to find out that wasn't true. He almost smiled at the memory of his childhood. But before he did, it faded at all the years that were taken away from him too. He looked at the left wall for a second, the back of the toys. He sighed. The toys were broken because, a couple of months ago, he was throwing them at the camera trying to break it down. But all he managed to do instead was get a small crack in the corner of the screen, where a tiny red LED was blinking. Chris looked back at the left wall, then the toys, and finally the camera. An idea popped into Chris's head. As he stared at the left wall, he picked up the yellow submarine that was sitting at the top of the pile. He inspected it, and found that it was the only toy that was unbroken. He checked the top of the submarine, and it was still as pointy as he'd remembered. He stood up and walked over to the left wall, his hand clutching the toy so tight that it hurt. As he lifted the submarine to the bottom of the crack on the wall, he dragged the sharp tip of the toy into the wall, causing the crack to get slightly bigger. He then stared at the camera for a few seconds, giving it a look that said, "I win," then went back to dragging the toy into the wall. After a short time, the toy was dull and useless. So he walked back to the pile of toys and placed the submarine in the middle of his pillow, as a sign for whoever worked here that no matter what happened to him now, he had won. Then he grabbed another toy and continued to work on the crack, with each stroke making the crack wider and deeper. Now he could almost fit half of his hand in. Every 5 minutes he turned around and looked at the camera, giving it the same look as the first time, but you could tell that you could see a hint of hope getting bigger and bigger each time he looked. The lesson on the intercom stopped early, and was quickly replaced with the voice of a man ordering Chris to stop. But he pursued on through the screams running through his head, as he used up each jagged piece of toy after toy after toy on the wall. He could almost feel the freedom on his fingers already. He started to imagine what sunlight felt like, and how snow looked. The commands on the intercom quickly changed to pleading, as Chris seemed to be able to fit his hand in now, and he was only halfway through the pile, and even then he could make them sharper again by sanding them on the wall. The pleading on the intercom stopped, and the room became dead silent, until the faint sound of footsteps was heard behind his door, getting louder and louder with each step. Chris smiled for the first time in 10 years as he quickly took one last glance around his prison of a room. The camera, the bed, the pile of trays and food, the toys, the metal door, and the yellow submarine sitting on his pillow. Then he heard the metal door unlock for the very first time. Well, a massive thank you to all of you for joining us around the fire this evening. Hope you had a good time. You did, didn't you? Good, okay. Well, we might just do this again in the near future. Hope you'll all be able to join us again real soon. That's it for tonight. You have a good one. We'll be back with you again real soon. But for now, bye-bye.